She gave away a $400 million empire without a single fight. Everyone in that courtroom thought she had lost her mind. Nobody noticed she had already won. When billionaire shipping magnate Walter Pierce died of a sudden stroke in his Savannah mansion, his widow Renata didn't cry in front of cameras, and she didn't beg anyone for sympathy. She simply sat in her lawyer's office 3 days later and listened as her stepchildren's lawsuit landed on the desk in front of her, demanding she be stripped of everything she owned within 30 days. His son Preston and his daughter Vivian had hated Renata from the very first dinner she ever shared with their father, 11 years earlier. To them, she would always be the woman who married in late and married for money, no matter how many years she spent actually building a life beside him. They never saw the nights she sat with Walter through his heart surgery recovery. They only saw the size of the house she now stood to inherit. Within 2 days of the funeral, Preston and Vivian filed an emergency claim demanding the family estate, full ownership of Pierce Maritime Logistics, and every liquid account Walter had left behind. Renata's attorney, a sharp, loyal man named Harold Boyce, sat across from her with the paperwork trembling slightly in his hands and told her plainly that they had more than enough evidence to crush this lawsuit in court. Renata told him to do the opposite. She told him to give the children exactly what they were asking for. Harold stared at her like she'd said something in another language. He reminded her that signing this agreement would leave her with almost nothing. No house, no company, no safety net at 61 years old. Renata simply folded her hands in her lap and said that some wars are won by losing the first battle on purpose. Word of her surrender spread through Savannah's old money circles within a week. People who had barely spoken to her at galas now whispered that grief had clearly broken something in poor Walter's widow. Preston and Vivian didn't bother hiding their satisfaction. They celebrated at a private club downtown, toasting to a victory they considered already finished, mocking the woman they assumed had simply run out of fight. The final court date arrived on a gray, humid Thursday morning. The courtroom was packed past capacity, filled with distant relatives, board members from Pierce Maritime, and at least 3 local reporters who'd caught wind that something about this case smelled different from a normal inheritance dispute. Renata walked in wearing a simple navy dress, calm in a way that unsettled people more than tears would have. Preston and Vivian sat across the aisle in tailored suits, exchanging small, smug glances every time the judge spoke. Their attorney, a polished corporate lawyer named Desmond Cole, stood and announced to the court that a full settlement had been reached, granting his clients complete and uncontested ownership of the Pierce estate and Pierce Maritime Logistics in its entirety. The judge looked toward Renata and asked, on the record, if she understood she was about to forfeit her claim to an estate worth roughly $400 million. She rose, walked to the podium without a single tremor in her hand, and signed. Preston actually laughed out loud. Vivian turned and smiled directly at the small crowd of reporters, already composing the headline in her head. They believed, completely, that they had just won everything, and that the quiet woman walking back to her seat had nothing left to give. That feeling lasted exactly 4 minutes. As the clerk prepared to stamp the documents, Desmond Cole flipped to the final page to confirm the signatures, the way any careful attorney does before filing. His eyes caught on a paragraph buried in the addendum, language he hadn't drafted and hadn't been shown before that morning. His face went white. His hand, holding the page, started to shake. Preston noticed first and snapped at him to explain what was wrong with a contract that handed them everything they wanted. Desmond couldn't get the words out fast enough. What none of them knew was that Pierce Maritime Logistics had a hidden problem buried deep in its books, a problem Renata had discovered nearly 4 months before Walter's death and chosen to say absolutely nothing about. Preston, who had quietly taken over operational control during his father's declining health, had been siphoning company funds through a shell vendor account for almost 3 years, covering routine shipping contracts with falsified invoices to mask nearly $19 million in missing assets. Renata had found the discrepancy by accident, reviewing old statements one sleepless night while Walter was in the hospital. She didn't confront Preston. She didn't tell Walter, who was already too weak for that kind of stress. She simply photographed every document, saved every file, and waited. When Preston and Vivian demanded full, unconditional ownership of the company, and every associated asset, Harold had quietly written a single clause into the final addendum at Renata's instruction. The clause stated that the new owners, by accepting full ownership, also accepted full legal and financial responsibility for any existing or prior liabilities of the company dating back 10 years. A second clause, buried 2 pages later, triggered an automatic independent financial audit of Pierce Maritime the moment ownership officially transferred. By signing for everything, Preston had just personally signed himself into the center of his own fraud investigation. Vivian grabbed the papers out of Desmond's hands, scanning frantically, asking what any of this actually meant. Desmond, still pale, explained quietly that the company's existing debts and legal exposure, once audited, would likely exceed the value of the entire estate. He explained that they hadn't just inherited a fortune, they had just legally inherited Preston's crimes. The courtroom shifted from celebration to chaos within seconds. Reporters who had come expecting a routine inheritance story suddenly realized they were watching something else unfold live. Vivian's voice cracked as she demanded someone fix this immediately. Preston sat frozen in his chair, staring at the page like it might change if he read it again. Renata stood at the podium, hands folded, watching the 2 people who had spent 11 years calling her a gold digger discover in real time exactly what greed costs when it moves faster than caution. 2 days later, federal investigators arrived at Pierce Maritime's downtown headquarters with a warrant. They seized servers, financial records, and personal devices. Preston was arrested on site, charged with corporate fraud, falsifying financial records, and tax evasion spanning nearly 3 years. Vivian, who hadn't directly committed the fraud but now owned half of a company drowning in seized assets and federal penalties, was forced to liquidate almost everything she personally owned just to keep pace with the lawsuits filed by furious creditors and shareholders in the weeks that followed. Renata, meanwhile, had quietly done one more thing before the lawsuit was ever filed. Months earlier, while Walter was still alive, he had personally set aside a private account in Renata's name alone, along with a handful of personal items that meant more to her than any boardroom ever had. None of it was part of the estate dispute. None of it was part of the settlement. It had simply never belonged to the empire the children fought so hard to take. Harold found her outside the courthouse afterward, still slightly stunned by what he'd just watched unfold. He asked her, honestly, how long she had been planning this. Renata told him the truth. She hadn't been planning revenge. She had simply been patient enough to let 2 people's greed do something she never would have had the stomach to do herself. She left Savannah within the month, settling into a quiet house near the coast of North Carolina, far from old money dinners and boardroom politics. She spent her mornings walking the beach and her afternoons volunteering at a small community library, eventually funding a modest scholarship for local students who reminded her, she said, of the woman she used to be before any of this money ever existed. Preston was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Vivian spent the next several years working an ordinary job, slowly paying down judgments that would follow her for most of her adult life. Pierce Maritime Logistics, once one of the largest shipping companies on the southern coast, was broken apart and sold off, in pieces within 18 months. Renata kept one photograph of Walter on a small shelf near her window, taken the year they married, long before any of this began. She never once regretted signing those papers. She had given away an empire to win something she actually wanted, which was simply the truth, finally sitting in the open where everyone could see it. If this story of patience, quiet strategy, and justice finally catching up to greed meant something to you, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in Renata's position. If you believe quiet people are often the most dangerous people to underestimate, share this video with someone who needs to hear that. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's another one coming very soon.